summit under the Italian presidency. And I must say from the very outset that for me and for Italy, it was a true honor to hold the presidency of the G7 in 2024. And there are a number of people I need to thank. First and foremost, all the team which was involved in organizing and managing an extremely complex event. I would also like to thank all those who were behind the many diplomatic consultations, starting with Ambassador Elisabetta Belloni and her staff. She was involved in very complex negotiations. I would like to thank my diplomatic advisor, Fabrizio Saggio, and I must also add that we had a very challenging agenda with a high number of delegations present, particularly during the outreach sessions. And I have to thank all those who made it possible for us to hold our meetings in such an efficient fashion. Thanks to them, we were able to work in this very efficient way. Things went smoothly. I would like to thank all of the officials of the Italian government and authorities for having made this a huge success, and there's no denying that it was precisely that. And I would like to thank all of the law enforcement bodies that made sure that everything took place in a safe and secure environment. I'd also like to thank the journalists who had to shuttle back and forth between Bari and Borgo Egnazia. Thank you for having provided coverage of the event for the benefit of Italy and the rest of the world. I'm grateful to the people of Apulia and the local authorities for their very warm welcome. And we believe that this wonderful part of Italy will gain even more recognition at a global level for its assets and beauties. At the end of the day, the result was due to excellent teamwork. And had there been any need for this, yet again, Italy has risen to the occasion and was successful in organizing such an important event. This is something the Italian people should all be proud of. At times we tend to forget what we can achieve, but I think today is a day when we should celebrate that. The summit ended yesterday with the formal approval of a communiqué that had been drafted in the previous days, and I would like to stress this because I think this is not something we should take for granted. It shows that we have one vision. The final communiqué, the Apulia G7 leaders communiqué, is a very, let's say, comprehensive document which addresses the many challenges we have to tackle. There are a number of issues that are addressed that are of huge relevance for us and for our future, and we have acted in a very coordinated way. I would like to thank Joe, Emmanuel, Rishi, Olaf, Justin, Fumio, Ursula, and Charles. I would like to thank their team, their Sherpas, for having contributed in such a positive and significant way to the success of this summit. And I would also like to thank the many leaders from other countries and international organizations that took part in the outreach session, which was one of the most representatives ever. We had the World Bank president, the IMF managing director, the OECD secretary general, the UN secretary general, the African Development Bank. We also had President Zelensky, who was present at the session on Ukraine. We had leaders from Brazil, holding the G20 presidency, India. We also had the president of Mauritania, his capacity as AU chair. We also had the leaders of Kenya, Algeria, Jordan, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, therefore the Gulf countries, Tunisia, Argentina. This is important because, as we said during our outreach meeting, G7 is not a fortress. It shouldn't defend itself from anything or anyone. It should be open to the world, to engage with others in order to find the right and most effective approach to our development. And it's not about the West against the rest of the world. This is a misconception. Our approach, I think, was made even clearer during the Italian presidency, and the narrative is completely different. And this is something that we are proud of as the Italian presidency. Yesterday was an extraordinary day because we were honored to have the Holy Father with us. I will never thank him enough for the great gift he bestowed upon us in the G7's almost 5 decades of history. This was the very first time that a pope attended the meeting. I wish to thank him. Thank him for having shared his priceless vision on the topic of artificial intelligence. And I also wish to express my appreciation to the Holy Father because he showed great respect and stayed for the entire session to listen to the words of all leaders. And this was a true gift, and I'll be eternally grateful to the Holy Father for his presence and for his message. Let's move on to content. In the final communiqué, the G7 shows that it stands together in defense of the rule of law, the international rules-based order. We know that this system has been, let's say, jeopardized with the Russian aggression and war in Ukraine, and the result is clear to us all. We know that areas of conflict are multiplying around the world, and we know that some saw things differently and didn't believe that we would continue to show support for Ukraine as we have. We continue to have a comprehensive, integrated, unified approach to help this nation, which has been attacked, to look to the future. And the G7 agreed on an additional support of $50 billion coming from the extra profit derived from seized African assets. This is Russian assets, excuse me. This is the result of a very important agreement, which will have to be ironed out and finalized in terms of the technicalities required, bearing in mind the reference framework that has already been adopted at the European Union level. We have to continue to stand by Ukraine for as long as is necessary, and of course this is essential in order to, let's say, reach a solution to ensure that peace may prevail. Today, as we know, Switzerland will be hosting a conference on Ukraine. Our foreign minister is already there, and Italy and with our partners has ensured that support for Ukraine has continued to be provided unwaveringly. With respect to the situation in the Middle East, we have reaffirmed the key, let's say, proposal put forward, particularly by the United States, for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all of the hostages, and a significant increase in humanitarian aid to the Gaza population. These are issues I also addressed in my bilateral meeting with President Joe Biden and with a number of other leaders this morning as well. And on behalf of Italy, I must say that I'm particularly proud of the commitment my country has shown over the last few months, particularly with respect to humanitarian support in the Middle Eastern crisis. And the G7 has once again reiterated that no effort must be spared to avert the risk of escalation in the region, to achieve a lasting solution with a two-state approach. And this is something that was also, let's say, confirmed by the countries that were invited to the outreach session. The Italian presidency of the G7 has been focusing specifically on its relationship with the African continent, and I'm very proud that the G7 as a whole has shared Italy's approach, which has, let's say, been one of the key features of this government. With the G7, we have to act together to develop a new development paradigm with an equal partnership so that African countries can, let's say, benefit from their resources. We have shared a number of, let's say, proposals with respect to a number of different and perfectly compatible approaches. We have the European Union Global Gateway, Italy's Mattei Plan, and the Partnership for Global Infrastructures and Investment, the PGII of the G7 that was launched 2 years ago. And we also organized a side event involving the private sector, Italian and U.S. leading companies, and also international development banks. And I think that this is truly one of the most significant achievements of the G7, because this actually bears witness to a very concrete approach. Many discussions have been held on Africa, many documents and papers have been produced, but we have to make sure that concrete action can follow, let's say, these words. We have focused on relaunching development and promoting food security, energy, digital technologies, infrastructures. And I believe that this really makes the difference. And I would like to rapidly mention the Apulian Food Security Initiative, the aim of which is to strengthen agricultural production and improve the resilience of infrastructures, energy for growth in Africa, to foster the production, generation, distribution of green energy. This is an initiative adopted by the G7, which was also supported by 7 African nations and some of the countries that attended the outreach meeting yesterday. The intention is that of extending this in a very open and transparent way. We also have the G7 Hub on the sustainable use of land to promote precisely the sustainable use of land, the African Virtual Investment Platform, the G7 Platform for Green Investments, to encourage investment in Africa with a special focus on clean energy, clean technologies. And lastly, I'd like to mention the establishment of a centre to promote the launch of digital systems, particularly focusing on AI. And we know there's a huge potential that can be tapped, linking these initiatives with the PGII and the Global Gateway, and of course the Mattei Plan. Another extremely important commitment on the part of G7 is that of ensuring that African economies participate more fully in global supply chains to ensure the development and distribution of wealth in those countries. So these are not just documents that we're talking about. We have always tried to ensure that concrete actions can follow, and this is something that the summit has been delivering. We believe we have to cooperate with Africa, and as you know, this is the best way to tackle another global emergency, i.e. the management of migration flows. Following Italy's initiative, for the very first time in its history, the G7 has addressed the issue of management and government of migration flows. The final declaration reiterates our commitment to tackle the root causes of migration in order to guarantee the first right that should be, say, ensured, the right to be able to stay at home in one's country, to be able to fulfill aspirations without having to leave. And then we also reiterated our commitment to fight trafficking in human beings. We obviously need this global coalition to work together to tackle the scourge of smuggling and trafficking networks that are a new form of slavery. I'm particularly proud of the outcome of this debate. This is a first for a G7 summit, and it's the first time this issue was addressed so clearly. We adopted the approach of two great Italians, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, who said that in fighting the mafia, you had to use a follow-the-money approach. We know that trafficking has become the most profitable activity for criminal networks. Let's say it is a more profitable activity than weapons smuggling. It is on a par with drug smuggling, and this is a very significant achievement indeed. And then we address the topic of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a topic that the Italian presidency chose to include in our discussions, as we pointed out in the 2 days we had meetings on, and we think that this initiative needs to be developed, but it must be human-centered, and humans should be the, let's say, ultimate purpose of the use of this technology. The Holy Father made a very significant and profoundly ethical contribution, and he talked about algorithmics. In other words, the need to ensure that algorithms are ethical. We succeeded in adopting the inclusion of a marking system so that citizens can recognize, let's say, the validity of certain technologies. We considered the impact of artificial intelligence on the labor market. We believe that this technological revolution will impact all sectors and the lives of millions and millions of workers. The declaration addresses a number of other topics: Indo-Pacific, supply chains, economic security, the climate-energy nexus. We're also aware that the major challenges that have to be addressed at a global level are interconnected, and this is why we have chosen to build on the results of the Japanese presidency last year. We have continued to keep focusing on the Indo-Pacific and economic security, the aim being that of sending a very clear signal, particularly to China. We're open to dialogue, but obviously our companies must be able to compete on an equal footing. We need a free and fair market because fair competition is essential for a market to be, let's say, effective. We also, of course, focused on the Mediterranean, our sea, which has once again been placed center stage. It is the, let's say, middle sea between the Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, as we have said, obviously considering the Persian Gulf as well. And this is an opportunity for Italy if well managed, because it means that we can, let's say, be a key player also for Europe in the field of energy, as we've been discussing, but also with respect to data, the energy of our digital societies. And this is a trend that is in fact going to be consolidated. We have the Blue Rama project, which will connect through the Mediterranean, India, and the European continent. And this is a strategic project that can set the example. And there are other themes, obviously climate change included in the communique. Obviously, we cannot afford to lose our, let's say, ambition to attain results without, let's say, any bias. Our approach is that of technological neutrality. And G7 must also take a very pragmatic approach so as to deliver on the commitments that we have made at a global level. Lastly, the COP28 in Dubai, bearing in mind that we have to focus on the needs of our productive systems and our citizens. In other words, we cannot afford to end up in a paradoxical situation whereby, in order to safeguard the environment, we're going to play into the hands of nations that adopt very aggressive policies against the environment. And within the G7, we also agreed on a firm political commitment in favor of a more just and stable tax system, the global minimum tax. And it's a topic that I particularly care about as chair of the forum. The OECD Secretary General explained that the OECD multilateral convention that was negotiated on the global minimum tax is ready to be signed. From a technical point of view, the G7 and the OECD have worked in parallel with the G20. Now it's up to individual countries to express its political will to join this, let's say, alliance. This, in sum, is what the summit has addressed, and I'm extremely, extremely pleased with the outcome. Obviously, in the course of the summit, I also had a number of bilateral meetings, excuse me. I had a bilateral meeting with President Joe Biden. We discussed the main, let's say, crises at a global level. We also looked at bilateral issues, investment opportunities and new technologies. And I would also like to point out that over the last year also, Italian export to the US increased by almost 7 billion. And this is tangible proof of the, let's say, consolidation of a fundamental partnership. I also had talks with Prime Minister Trudeau and President Lula in order to ensure continuity between the Italian presidency this year and the Canadian presidency next year, and continuity between the G7 and the G20, which, as we know, comes under the Brazilian presidency with Canada. We also adopted the action plan to strengthen bilateral cooperation. The same is true for Japan. And we had meetings with the Prime Minister of Japan on this topic with Mr. Modi. We also explored opportunities to strengthen our strategic partnership, which began in 2023 with the President of Algeria, Tebboune, whom I met this morning. We took stock of the pilot projects which are linked to the Mattei Plan for Africa. The Mattei Plan for Africa, in addition to being discussed with President Tebboune, was also discussed in our meeting with the President of the World Bank and the African Development Bank Group. Together, we have looked at joint initiatives for the development of African countries with the president of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Adesina. We also identified new financial instruments to launch the Mate plan, particularly to attract foreign private investment to Africa. And this is just a short summary of the meetings I had during the summit. I obviously had exchanges with other leaders, King of Jordan, President Milei, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the President of Kenya, Ruto, the UN Secretary General. So clearly we had discussions with all of the leaders present at the summit. I also had the opportunity to have an exchange with the president of Mauritania. Mauritania is the AU chair at the moment, and as you know, President Mohamed Ould Ghazouani was the keynote speaker in our session on Africa. And I'd like to end by saying that the summit is over, but the Italian presidency is looking to the next few weeks and months when ministerial meetings will be held, in the course of which we will continue to, let's say, focus on our priorities. We started on the 1st of January, and we will, by the end of the year, have held 21 ministerial meetings, plus more than 130 technical meetings, in addition to meetings with civil societies, Women 7, Youth 7, Civil 7, Labour 7, Business 7 for the first time. I would like to also mention that the Italian presidency this year chose to organize ad hoc meetings on the issue of defense, on the issue of disability, which I believe is something else that the Italian presidency should be rightly proud of, because this is something that had never occurred beforehand in a G7 format, and we also focused on tourism. So, as I have already said, I'm extremely proud of our achievements and of this success of the summit. Italy took centre stage over the last few days. The world has been watching us. This was a huge responsibility, but I'm extremely pleased and proud of the way in which our country has once again amazed people and has shown the way forward. I would like to thank all of the members of this extraordinary team.
So let's start with the questions. Thank you. Let's start with the questions. Manuel Lauria from Republic, if you'd like to stand. Thank you. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. One of the passages in the conclusions of the summit, which has been much discussed, is the one on rights. Could you tell us here why the term abortion was not included in the conclusions? And why was there just a reference to the final declaration of Hiroshima? And the French President Macron actually said that he regretted this and reminded us that France has included the right to abortion in their constitution. Would you propose the same thing in Italy? And in this connection, I'd like to ask whether your majority wishes to change Law 194 on interrupting pregnancies, and also the questions about future top jobs in Europe. And I'd like to know whether you support the candidacy of Ursula von der Leyen. And I've said 1,000 times that I don't want to amend Law 194. I want to apply it in all its parts. I think it's a very good law which doesn't require any changes. With the reason as far as the reason why there's no reference to the word abortion is not there, I've already answered, because usually in the final documents of these sessions, things which are already taken as ascertained are not repeated. We repeated the reference to the Declaration of Hiroshima. In the Declaration of Hiroshima, it was very clear that free and safe access to abortion was guaranteed. And when something is repeated, generally there's a reference to previous documents. I think that this debate is something which has been artificially promoted. There was no debate on this in our discussion because there was nothing, no reason to argue on any of this. So I understand the reasons why these arguments arise. I understand why some people fuel these fires, but it was not something which we had any heated discussion on. With regard to the European posts, we'll have a meeting on Monday, as you know, and that will be where our assessments will be presented. You also know how the proposal on the presidency of the European Commission works. It's up to the PPE, which is has the highest number of members of parliament. When the proposal comes in, we'll see what the assessments are on the other top posts. We'll obviously be making our judgments, and what I'm interested in the first two topics actually, which are of importance to me, and that will be the basis on which I'll make my decision for the Italian government. Obviously, having heard the other parties in the majority coalition, is first of all that Italy has its role recognized in terms of responsibilities to be held when the Commission is established, and that Europe understand the message which has been conveyed by the European citizens. Because if we want to draw a lesson from the elections in Europe, and if we want to read that as meaning everything's fine, I think we'd be wrong. The Europeans are asking for pragmatism. They're asking for a less ideological approach on a number of issues. They want Europe to deal more with certain priorities which have not been dealt with intensively, and they want things which have been dealt with intensively be dealt with less intensively. And I hope that message is understood, because citizens vote for a reason. They want to lend a message to a politician on which line is to be followed. I think that the message has been conveyed very clearly, and that's what I'm interested in. You know what I think in terms of the priorities Europe should deal with in the coming years, and we will make our assessments based on these considerations. We're not playing games of filling in all the slots before people elect. I think we have to respond to the indications we receive from our citizens. Angela Lante, Reuters. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. With regard to the agreement you reached on the 50 billion loan to Ukraine, I'd like to ask you, how much will the payment of Italy amount to? Will this provided directly by the government or through the European Union? And there's one point which is still unclear in this loan. What would happen if the Russian assets, which are frozen, which underpin this loan, were to return into the hands of Moscow? In that case, would the loan weigh on our national accounts and therefore also on the Italian balance? Thank you. I think that, as you know, the 50 billion loan has already been announced, will be provided by the United States, then Canada, United Kingdom, and probably Japan, compatibly with the constitutional limits which exist, have announced that they will also want to be involved. Currently, European nations are not involved in this loan, also considering the fact that all these assets are frozen in Europe. So Europe is already contributing by identifying a guarantee mechanism for the repayment of this loan. As we know, this is something which has to be considered by the European Council and will technically have to be sorted out by the European Ministers of Finance. With regard to these assets being unfrozen, as the assets are frozen because of sanctions, and since the sanctions are linked to the aggression against Ukraine, I think the assets would be unfrozen only in the case of a peace process. But I believe that a peace process, in the case of a peace process, one would also have to negotiate who's going to pay for the damages suffered by Ukraine. So I think it's something which should be dealt with in a different way. Paolo Capelleri from the ANSA agency. Thank you, Prime Minister. Before this G7, there was a big dispute in Parliament. The Speaker of the Senate said it was a harakiri event before the G7 meeting. I'd like to know what you say about this. I'd like to, you said on the eve of the G7, and you tried to connect it to what happened here. I found it very serious that there have been representatives in the majority who fall into the trap of provocations. I think those provocations will increase. I think Italian citizens have to ask themselves how much political representatives who are trying to stir up matters, how much they love their countries, trying to occupy the seats of the government when the eyes of the world on us. So all of those who try to give us lessons on the respect for the institution should start themselves by showing their respect for our institutions. But in any case, they didn't manage to spoil the success of this fine meeting. Virginia Pietromarchi from Al Jazeera. Good afternoon. If it's not a problem, I'll ask you the question in English.
The G7 has once again delivered strong support for Ukraine, both financially and militarily. It has failed, though, to criticize the war conduct of Israel, whose forces have killed more than 37,000 people in 8 months, and which ignores ICJ rulings and UN resolutions. How many more civilian deaths would it take for the G7 to condemn or consider steps like sanctions or a ban on weapons sales to Israel, similar to those taken against Russia? Grazie.
Look, I think we have to remember who began that, and it wasn't Israel. So first of all, we should remind that there was somebody who took civilians, women, children, and did something that was incredible. Now what we have to do is to work for peace, and it is exactly what we are doing. And to work for peace, we have to dialogue, and we have to recognize the right of Israel to be safe, the right of Israel to live in peace, and the right of Palestinians to have their own state to live in a peaceful way. And it is exactly what we are doing. And it is the only way to deal with this problem. It's not about simply saying something about somebody. It is working, dialoguing with everyone. What I said before and what I think is that Israel, it looks like Israel is jumping into a trap. For the trap of Hamas was to isolate it. Seems it is working. So whose friend of Israel needs to give clear words to Israel for its safety? And it is exactly what Italy is doing.
Roberto Kinzari,
TG1. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. You reminded us that one central image in this G7 meeting was the extraordinary participation of Pope Francis. What impressed you most in the words of Pope Francis on artificial intelligence? And with regard to this technology, at this panel of leaders, which area has raised most concerns or most hope? For example, the military use in positive terms and negative terms, and which seems to be the ring of power, and which has huge power but can also enslave you. I think that the words which the Holy Father addressed to us on the relationship between this technology and weapons and defense was a very important message. Holy Father said no machine can independently decide whether to do away with the life of a human being. These are some of the huge existential issues which are raised by artificial intelligence and which we need to and on which we need to question ourselves in depth. I think this is one of the issues, because sometimes I had this feeling in the debate, we shouldn't deal with this issue as if it were all white or all black. We need to develop it, and that's all, and we'll leave it to the market on the one hand, or the message which sometimes appears to be the message of those who say we need to ensure that human beings have to be at the center of the process and we shouldn't develop artificial intelligence. I said at the end of the outreach session yesterday that instruments, tools are neutral. They're not in themselves good or bad, so it depends how we manage to turn them towards what is good, or even how we can limit the risks of what's bad. Artificial intelligence has a lot of risks, but it also conveys a lot of opportunities. It's a multiplier. What do we want to multiply is the question we need to ask ourselves. And obviously the answer is not an easy one, but among the risks we need to include impact on the labor market, which has been one of the Italian focuses, because we are accustomed to a technology which optimizes human skills, but replacing jobs which progress has accustomed us to was generally replacement of physical jobs, and that allowed human beings to focus on higher level work with conceptual work. When it's our intelligence which runs the risk of being replaced, the impact on the labor market can be very, very big. We need to come to terms with a future where an increasing number of people run the risk of not being useful, and an impact which reaches very high-level areas such as the professions and other areas. We're talking about health and the role of AI in the health sector. Obviously, use AI as a tool to help us to find cures for diseases which we haven't yet succeeded in doing. But if we're thinking, that's one thing, but if we think that we can replace doctors with applications owned by the pharmaceutical companies, that's something else. And I think we need to realize that sometimes we swap our freedom for convenience, and the results of what we're doing may only become clear when we can no longer take any corrective action. That's one aspect connected with artificial intelligence. Another aspect connected with artificial intelligence is that we're obviously going towards a world where it'll be very difficult to recognize what's true and what's not untrue. And the impact this has in particular on democratic systems in the relationship between politics and citizens is potentially devastating. Another problem linked to AI is that all the major innovations which produce competitive advantages also lead to tension and the risk of, therefore, of chaos on top of prior chaos. So these are all things we have to deal with bravely and boldly and carefully. And we shouldn't do that by separating the political decision maker and the people developing AI. This is a discussion which needs to be carried out with the people developing AI. And that's why one of the deliverables which we decided to have in the conclusions of the Italian presidency is labeling, to have a label which allows those using AI to recognize companies which undertake certain commitments in terms of transparency, in terms of attributing central role to people. I think that's an important development, and so this was a very fascinating debate. It truly is an interesting debate. It's not something which ends here. We'll be organizing other initiatives on this. There are other countries which are organizing initiatives too. You remember last year also attended the safety summit organized by my friend Rishi Sunak. So everybody is questioning themselves on this issue, and obviously the debate can remain at European level. The European Union's already become involved, and Italy's become involved. We've all established our rules, but it's also one of those areas where it becomes fundamental to share our activity with a lot of other international actors. So these are measures which, in order to be effective, have to be taken at the global level. We tried to do what we could because this was certainly one of the forums in which to discuss this global governance. Stefano Pitrella from the Washington Post. Petrella, sorry.
Thank you in advance for your time. If you don't mind, I would like to ask my question in English.
Yeah.
Now, as a leader, you've been empowered at the G7 summit you just hosted as the only one of your European counterparts with a recent electoral victory. The G7 final document includes a reference to the risk of backward steps on LGBTQ+ rights, an issue which had already been raised with you in the past. How will such commitment affect your political action on social rights henceforth? And how do you intend to employ your clout as an increasingly influential conservative politician? Will you try to leave your mark by bringing more change to Europe and Italy? Will you, for instance, seek to curb green policies you see as too costly, or support blocking puberty blockers for minors?
Non sono sicura di aver capito tutta la domanda.
I'm not sure I understood the whole, all of the question, but there's no step backwards. Yes, thank you. That way I'll be sure I've understood the question. Yeah, I was saying, to go to the question directly, the final document in G7 includes a reference to the risk of steps backward on the LGBTQ plus rights, which an issue has already been raised by G7 colleagues to you. And so your commitment contained in the final declaration of G7, how will this influence the political situation from now and in general at the European level? With your growing influence at the European level, how are you going to influence European policies on what you consider here? I was giving you examples referring to green policies or in detail references to puberty blockers. With regard to issues like puberty blockers, I think national states have to have this responsibility. I don't think the EU should deal with this. With regard to LGBTQ, I would like to thank you for quoting the conclusions, because people have said there's been a step backwards, and what you quoted shows there's been no step backwards. Now, with regard to my political influence, I think what's happened in these 2 years of Italian government have demonstrated a very different situation compared with the narrative which unfortunately is presented by some so-called observers. I'd like to remind you that the Italian government's taken no step backwards from the current rules on abortion, LGBTQ rights and so forth, and see our expectations, sorry, the expectations of some have been disappointed, but these because this narrative wasn't in line with the truth, which is often happening in Italy and elsewhere when we told the situation in Italy. Francesca Malfitano from the Messaggero. Hello, Prime Minister. Inside the conclusions of the summit, there was a reference to the Olympic truce. And do you think that this could be a way to reach a de-escalation in the Ukraine? You stressed the role of Joe Biden in supporting Kiev, but at the next G7 in Canada, there might be Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden. Are you concerned that the role of the United States may change in this area?
I'm not concerned with respect to the upcoming presidential elections in the United States. Obviously, I never meddle with elections in other countries. I don't like doing that, and that is something I don't like others to do. I think that the French request is a very sound one, and there was unanimity in support of it. I don't know whether it will actually be possible to obtain this Olympic truce, but this is another element in a very complex debate. Obviously, as you know, this is a reference that was also made in line with a United Nations resolution. We will have to wait and see, but I'm very happy that we have done our share and intend to continue working towards possibly including this element of de-escalation. And in closing, I would also like to wish all the best of luck to all of the Italian athletes who will be competing in the 2024 Olympic Games. Now, Miki Nuara, Japan TV.
Grazie, buongiorno, Presidente. Let me speak in English. Thank you. And I'd like to ask about the action plan between Japanese government and Italy's interest in the Indo-Pacific region. And Italy is currently strengthening the defense and security cooperation between Japan, and there are such as important projects such as development of joint fighter jets and dispatch of aircraft carrier in the summer. But at the same time, I guess that China, not only Japan, but China would be the important partner for the development of Italy. So in this sense, how will you keep the balanced position in this area of Indo-Pacific area? And what kind of cooperation do you hope to strengthen with Japan? Grazie mille.
Grazie a lei.
Thank you for your question. Now, when it comes to cooperation with Japan, it can be claimed that huge progress has been made over the last 2 years, as you're aware. Firstly, we defined a strategic partnership, and now we have signed a plan of action, which goes to say that we intend to continue making progress step by step towards strengthening our bilateral cooperation. We're working on this plan of action to promote further cooperation in many areas: security, defense, economic security, supply chains, which, of course, as we know, are also the focus of the G7 debate, the energy transition, space. So, as you are aware, we have focused specifically on strategic priorities. And in that respect, I would also like to point out that over the last year, Italy has increased its presence in the Indo-Pacific with a number of campaigns, with our fleet, with our planes. And I think that our presence is increasingly important and strategic. This is also true of the G7 presence in general in the Indo-Pacific. The issue of supply chains obviously means that we have to carry out some very careful, let's say, analyses. Obviously, when we were faced with, say, an economic shock, we realized that we had allowed supply chains to evolve in a direction that was unpredictable with the involvement of let's say, players, the action of which we couldn't, let's say, foresee. And this has led to choking points in our supply chains. The challenge is de-risking and the ability to make sure that we have shorter supply chains. And, of course, the other aim is friend-shoring. That means that we have to make sure that our supply chains are linked to those of like-minded countries. And this is something we're also doing with Japan. Obviously, when it comes to China, I already made my position clear in my opening remarks. China is an important player. Italy intends to pursue, let's say, its dialogue and engagement with China. But as one does normally, we need to have, let's say, common rules. This is essential to make sure that companies can operate with the same rules. The free market is a great achievement, but for a market to be truly free, it must also be fair, which goes to say that there has to be a level playing field. The message that all of the key players, I'm sure, can understand is essential for this dialogue. Andrea Bonini, Sky TG. afternoon, Prime Minister. Migration flows is a topic in the final communique, and there is also mention of incentivating regular migration flows. What measures are envisaged with respect to the international coalition against human trafficking? How will that evolve? Is there a roadmap? What resources will be allocated to that end? Thank you. With regard to migration flows, legal migration, the document reiterates that there has to be four-pronged approach. Firstly, the fight against traffickers, the need to address the root causes of migration, and this is something I mentioned when discussing Africa, the ability to manage and favor legal pathways for migration. You will recall that when we launched the three-year flows decree in Italy, the idea was to allocate additional shares for legal migration to those countries that assisted us in fighting illegal migration and trafficking. Obviously, the issue of legal migration is fundamental, but the conclusions indicate that this is something for nation states to establish. International multilateral organizations cannot step in and decide how legal migration should be managed by different countries. With regard to the G7 coalition against migrant trafficking, the challenge is that of exchanging information, promoting joint investigation initiative to dismantle trafficking gangs, sharing intelligence, working together, and harmonizing legislation is also important. Take the case of the seizure of illicit gains using the same approach, which I mentioned earlier, the follow the money approach introduced in the fight against the mafia by Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. This plan of action must be adopted and implemented as swiftly as possible. The ministers of the interior will start to work on defining a plan so that we can be as quickly as possible able to implement this plan. Ronny Gasbarri, La Presse. If you could please stand. Thank you. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. 3 questions linked to dates. Is your mission to China likely? Is there a date set for that? Then the European top jobs. I would like to know whether it would be better to wait for the results of the elections in France, as Macron might have suggested. And with respect to China, is this something that the G7 is going to address? Sorry, are you referring to China again? Yes. Well, yes, we are working on a mission to China, which will take place, should take place in the coming weeks. We haven't set a date yet, but it is something I would like to do. With respect to our bilateral plan, as you know, I received an invitation from President Xi Jinping some time ago. And with respect to the top jobs in Europe, we have not discussed this so far. I read the statements made by our Foreign Minister, Mr. Tajani, very sensible statements indeed. If this topic were to be discussed, we can do this on Monday. I think I might have answered all your questions. Yes, thank you. Francesca Pozzi, Mediaset. Please, if you could stand. Thank you. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Going back to the war in Ukraine, yesterday, Russia, responding to the G7 conclusions, established the conditions for ceasefire, withdrawal of Ukraine troops from Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and other areas, and a statement that it would not intend to join NATO. I've read these statements on a possible proposal. I believe this is more to do with propaganda than a true sound proposal for negotiation. You know better than I do that unilaterally Russia actually decided the annexation of for Ukrainian regions. As we know, it is not controlling these regions completely. If President Putin is saying we're prepared to sit at the negotiation table if Ukraine recognizes the annexation or invasion and if it surrenders parts of its territory, parts of these regions, well, I don't think that this would be a very sound proposal. I mean, it would be hard to claim that Ukraine has to leave Ukraine in order to be able to sit down at the negotiation table. This sounds more like a propaganda exercise during a G20 meeting. President Putin said, we would like peace in Ukraine. And I said, well, just withdraw your troops and you'll have it. I'm sure that there is the attempt to tell a different story. And this is a form of, let's say, deliberate disinformation with respect to the responsibilities. A local journalist, Nuovo Quotidiano di Puglia, Francesco Gioffredi, from the local daily. Thank you, Prime Minister. You explained why you chose Apulia for hosting the G7 summit. I would like to ask you to tell us whether Apulia rose to the occasion. Tell us something more with respect to your perception of how things went. And then you've always said that Apulia is a strategic bridge in the Mediterranean. Now, how can this be, let's say, further, developed from now on? Well, I think that from now on, it'll be clear that global leaders have become fully aware of where they have spent these last few days. I would like to express my appreciation to the people of Apulia. They have really risen to the occasion, and this was the best possible answer to the biased remarks that were featured in the international media. Some might have come here with certain ideas. I'm sure that they will leave with a different picture. The power, the strength of this region and of Italy as a whole, but of Apulia in particular, is its ability to be true to its roots, to its traditions. Yesterday, at the end of our meetings, Andrea Bocelli, as you know, sang for the leaders, and that was a great gift. And I wanted last night's event to be characterized by Apulian food. We had panzerotti, we had the typical Taranta music, we had women making by hand the typical pasta, the orecchiette. There was a typical, let's say, show of lights that is featured in religious festivals. This was Apulia, and I was proud to see that the G7 leaders' jaws dropped, and at times their mouths also dropped because of the wonderful experience, the taste. For instance, we were given bracelets made with olive stones, tables, furniture were made from the olive trees that had to be felled on account of the Xylella infestation. And the theme of the evening was that of a global village, that of seeing the great leaders of the world address global challenges, global issues in a village setting. And we cannot appropriately address these challenges ahead unless we remember where we come from. and we remember our roots and our heritage. And I'm glad that we're able to bring these elements together. For many, they seem to be juxtaposed. I think that they are able to mutually reinforce the significance of these themes, and I'm sure and hope that leaders will come back on holiday to Apulia. Thank you all for your hard work. You were really important players, and safe travels.
네, 뭐,